Hi guys and welcome back. So today I want to talk about an audiobook that popped up in my recommendations on Audible a few days ago, and I just finished it yesterday. So today we are talking about Body of Proof by Darrell and Sophie Ellis. It's from 2019. It's probably one of the very first Audible originals that I listened to. So Body of Proof tells the story of the disappearance of office worker Suzanne Pilley, who disappeared in 2010 on her way to the office in her hometown Edinburgh, Scotland. And it became one of the most high-profile homicide cases during that period, mainly because of two reasons. It was a homicide that was very unique because it was a no-body homicide, meaning that no body was ever found. And in addition to that, there was also no forensic evidence at all recovered at any of the locations that this horrible murder has happened. So in the end, David Gilroy, one of the co-workers of Suzanne, he got convicted for the crime of murdering Susan, and he got convicted without any physical evidence. He got convicted on a lot of circumstantial evidence that altogether tied up this whole story of him having killed this woman in 2010. And so David and Susan, they had an affair, so there was some connection there. They were co-workers, they had some history there, and they did have a very tumultuous and emotional relationship, so that much was clear. Now David in the end received a lifelong term of imprisonment for the murder of Suzanne Pilley. And he, until this day, maintains that he is innocent, that he didn't do anything. He launched a lot of appeals already that, as far as I know, all of them so far were deferred or not approved and were not didn't go ahead. So in this audiobook, Body of Proof, Darrell and Sophie, they discovered that there was a lot of missing evidence, and some of the evidence that could have potentially helped David's defense case was not used during the original trial. Darrell and Sophie, they just were very much fascinated by this case and wanted to, uncover if there was anything missing, if there was anything left out of the original investigation, and just try and find out everything that was to know about this case. And that's what they did in this series of podcasts, basically, that was collected in an audiobook. And when the story starts out, first, both Darrell and Sophie, they seem to be very much convinced of David's guilt over this crime, but the more that they learn, the more we see both of these authors kind of shift their point of view towards the end, where it's almost like they feel that he is most likely innocent, or at least there is not enough sufficient evidence, or there was never enough sufficient evidence to prove what they call beyond reasonable doubt that he was the murderer of Suzanne Pilley. One thing that I found very unique and exciting about this story is the way that it is told. So this is something that I found very unusual, and I don't think I've ever experienced a story in this way. So the way that the story is told is through there's some narration as well going on that kind of binds together these stories, but in the end it's Darrell and Sophie. They are going out, they are trying to uncover evidence, they are going after all the old details of the cases, they are meeting a lot of people that were involved and were close to both David and Susan during this original case. And there's a lot of interview that they do, and they are part of this whole audiobook. And then there's a lot of discussion and kind of after interview discussion between Darrell and Sophie, what they kind of thought about this person, what potentially their next steps could be. A lot of speculation as well as going on, what they think they might help them uncover more about this case, how they feel about David during each point of going through this, the history of this case, basically. So they start from the very beginning, and they try to follow basically each step that both Susan and David took during the case of the 2 days where this murder was supposed to happen. And they try to, kind of piece together this puzzle and line up timelines together with both paper evidence, with a lot of CCTV evidence is talked about in this case, and they just kind of try to figure out what the case is like. And what is most unique about this as well is that they were actually given the green light by David to ask him any questions they wish, and he was very, of course he could be lying, but he was very forthcoming in answering any questions that they had. They had regular phone calls with David every Sunday for a period of, I believe, 1.5 years. So there's a lot of information and material directly from the defendant and directly from the person that was accused of committing this horrible crime in here. And a lot of this information seems to be in the hopes of him getting, a new appeal going. At the time that this book was written, this audiobook was produced, which was in 2019. So that's what made it very fascinating for me, made it very exciting for me. What is very unusual is I would not have expected to like this book, because usually I do enjoy audiobooks, but usually I do not like dramatized audiobooks. I try to avoid them, mainly because many of these dramatized audiobooks, they feel to me as they're like there's so much overacting going on that it takes away from the actual story, and it takes away from the readers or the listeners' imagination that I want to impose on that story, and then kind of have my own point of view from that story. So I find dramatized audiobooks usually very annoying. Here, in this case, it worked very well, because I think it's mainly because it was fiction. And a lot of it was just interviews or discussions that were recorded between different people. So it's how people actually talk and how people actually act, and not this like over dramatized kind of narration that we usually have in dramatized fiction audiobooks. Another thing that I want to mention, and I found very weird. So this book, it popped up on my Audible, and I thought, okay, well, this sounds like an interesting crime novel. Let's listen into it. It's part of my Audible plan anyway, so I don't need to pay for it. I started listening to it, and I was fully convinced that it is fiction, that it is a novel. And then only by, I would say, 15 minutes, 20 minutes into it, I started questioning, well, could this actually be based on a true story, or at least partly based on a true story? I guess I did not read the plot or the intro on Audible very well, but then I just started reading up on it, reading a little bit the intro of the Wikipedia pages and stuff, and realized, oh, whoa, this is actually true crime, and not just, partially based on a case. This is actually discussing and kind of revealing new evidence and following up on that case. So I was even more into it after that point. Now, maybe a little bit more to the plot of the story. So on one morning on the way to the work, Susan, she disappears, and basically police very quickly, I think on the second day after her disappearance, they charge David, one of her co-workers, her affair, with the crime. And the way then the book is told is kind of in a hierarchical way of from when it started, when she disappeared, to basically the trial, and then the appeals that were going on, and how everything came together. And so what I found very interesting is how, which kind of materials were used by police and prosecution to make their case, which kind of materials and evidence were apparently willfully decided by the defense not to try to include in their defense, because they seem to have been so sure that he could not have been found guilty, because there was such an obvious lack of any physical evidence, and also even with the absence of her body, which was until this date never found anywhere. So they were very much convinced that he would be found not guilty, that he would be found innocent. So, and that's kind of what Darrell and Sophie dive into in trying to uncover all that kind of evidence for the defense that has not been used in the trial, and they believe produce what again they call in the Scottish justice system reasonable doubt that would lead to a situation where he would not have been found guilty, basically. And they hone in on a lot of details. So, for example, CCTV is a big part here that they are looking at, from a lot of technical details, like timelines not lining up, because the internal clocks of CCTVs, they don't always match up. They sometimes, these systems are on a server, sometimes they are completely independent, sometimes they, can vary up to 1 or 2 minutes depending on where the camera is from. And two very, typical things that you and I would realize with just looking at the picture. Well, was this actually Susan? And to situations where, they had CCTV cameras showing nothing at all where she would have on her path had to show up. So there's a lot of like these small little mysteries in here, and I had a lot of moments when they produced new evidence and they produced new information, and I was like, oh my god, how could this possibly be? Like, what went wrong here? And I found it very intriguing. I found it very interesting. I was absolutely in it and enjoying listening to this case. It was only about 5 hours, and I was through with it within 1.5 days, basically. It so much drew me into this story. Also, in the end of the book, the two authors, they kind of talk with each other and whether they think now that he is guilty or not, and they kind of weave around that question, which is understandable. For me as well, I don't think I know enough about the case, or I know enough about this industry that I could have an very well informed opinion on this. But what I can say is that the way I understand this system in Scotland, with that basically a defendant has to be it has to be proven beyond reasonable doubt that somebody is guilty of a crime for them to actually be found guilty. Like, that raised quite a lot of questions with me, because beyond reasonable doubt, that sounds very strong for me. So as long as you could imagine something else happen, or as long as there is a potential for something else to happen, then that, from my point of view, would already be quite serious doubt, actually, that that person has committed a crime, right? And what they talk about in the book, for example, is like, well, what is reasonable doubt? Well, it's above 90% or 91%, something like this they mentioned. But, well, then again, he was judged by a jury of, I think, 8 or 9 jurors, and then in Scotland they don't need everybody to agree on him being guilty. They only need a majority. So that again would mean that only 50% of the jurors need to be 90% sure that he did the crime for him to be convicted of the crime. And then for me the question is just, well, how does that align with the term reasonable doubt, beyond reasonable doubt? So I do feel there was, like, at least from the evidence and the information that was shown here, in these 5 hours, I do feel there were quite a lot of open questions where I do wonder, well, how could this possibly be beyond reasonable doubt? But I would never be able to say if he's guilty or if he's not guilty. I simply don't have the experience, the knowledge, the information to make a well-founded judgment on that situation. But I do find that there's seem to be more gaps in the story than there are connections in the story, at least from my point of view. So did any of you guys, are you guys familiar with the case of Suzanne Pilley and David Gilroy and her disappearance? What is your opinion on it? Found it very, very interesting, and I will be following the case, so it will be interesting to see if there's any new information coming up in the future. But what this tells me, basically, to get into a ranking here, into a rating here, so from my side, that's 4 out of 5 stars for Body of Proof. I really very much enjoyed listening to it. It was short paced, it was very intriguing. It was fascinating to listen to this true crime story, and it's very much up my alley. So I really very much enjoyed this story, and what it tells me is that there are actually very good and very interesting Audible original productions out there, and I probably should not just skip over them whenever they show up in my Audible, and should listen to a few of them, and hopefully find more stories that I do enjoy and can enjoy for free, because it's part of the plan already that I'm paying for every month for Audible. But yeah, let me know what you guys thought of Body of Proof, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye guys.